Joining me is Jack Kelly. Now, he is a foreign correspondent, war correspondent, and just came back from Israel. He has some information about these attacks. Jack, what can you tell us happened first in New York?
Apparently what appears to happen was that at the same time two planes hit the building, that the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So two planes and explosives that were in the building, is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is still unconfirmed. That is what the FBI is going on at this point.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. Building is about to blow up. Pull it back.
I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull. And then we watched the building collapse.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Hey friends, thank you so very much for tuning in. Like my last two interviews, this one is most assuredly going to be deemed not suitable for most advertisers by our fascist friends at YouTube. Do you know why? Because it's hardcore truth that we're about to broach, and I am so thrilled to have on the line right now Richard Gage. He's the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Barbara Honegger, a lead researcher, author, and public speaker on 9/11. Her book, of course, is called October Surprise. She was also a high-level official at the White House and DOJ. And we have on the line the president and chairman of the board from the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, David Meiswinkle. Let me welcome you each separately. First, Richard, thank you so much. I feel like we know each other. We kind of do. I met you back in the day, literally, when I was cutting my teeth in truth. I had joined the local chapter of the 9/11 Truth Movement here in my community, and we brought you in to speak, and we all went out and had a beer with you, and that goes back to like 2006, 2007, Richard.
And that's just when I got started also, Sean. I mean, that was like less than a year after I first heard about what really happened at the World Trade Center from David Ray Griffin on the radio, also from Bonnie Faulkner's Guns and Butter program. That was an extraordinary year. We got launched. 15 of the architects that I worked with at the time thought I was nuts when I started talking about this, but then I bribed them with pizza and brought them in, and they saw the evidence, and by God, all 15 of them said, my God, you're right. All three of these World Trade Center skyscrapers were brought down with controlled demolition. And now we have 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition 12 years later now. And we're off and running. And today's exciting news is even better.
Well, I'm just so thrilled to be able to share this news with folks. And in fairness, I want to give a shout out to my good friend Jim over at Northwest Liberty News. He brought you guys on about a week ago, and it was the first I had heard of this news. So we're going to share that news in a second here. It's such a big deal, guys. It involves a World Trade Center grand jury, a 9/11 grand jury, digging into the truth of what happened here. And I advised, after listening to that interview, I advised Larry Silverstein to lawyer up because justice is coming. Let's officially introduce Barbara. I hope I didn't butcher your bio. You have a noteworthy bio.
Good. No, did pretty well.
Well, did I flesh that out enough to say you're a high-level official in the White House and DOJ? Tell people about your experience.
Well, I think just to add to that, that was in the Reagan administration. To add to that, I think people should know, because it speaks to the credibility of myself as a researcher for 9/11 and anything else. For 16 years, I was the senior military affairs journalist at the Naval Postgraduate School here in Monterey, California, and I live in the Monterey Peninsula of California. And the Naval Postgraduate School is built by the Department of Defense, by the Pentagon itself, as DoD's premier Science, Technology, and National Security Affairs Graduate Research University. So for 16 years, I was the senior journalist there.
Outstanding. Well, I think it goes without saying that there are white hats in the military and in government. Not everyone's corrupt, right, Barbara?
No, I wasn't.
No. All right, David, why don't you share some of this incredible news with us that the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry has impaneled a special grand jury to investigate the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. And guys, the third one is World Trade Center 7. And of course, that's the one that BBC's Jane Stanley reported about having already collapsed 20 minutes before it actually fell at free fall speed. David, what say you?
Yes, thank you for having us on. This event is a historical event, without a doubt. As you know, we're talking about the crimes of 2001, and those crimes were never properly investigated. There has never been a grand jury investigation into these events. And for the first time now in 17 years, we have an acknowledgement from the United States Attorney that they're going to do a 9/11, basically WTC, the Twin Towers and Building 7 investigation into the crimes of 9/11. And they're going to present this information, this evidence, to a grand jury, which is comprised of 23 people. And for the first time in the United States, the people of America will be seeing evidence that documents categorically that explosives, bombs, controlled demolition were involved in the bringing down of those 3 mammoth buildings, and that the story or the fabrication that has been put out there thus far, that office fires were responsible for bringing those buildings down, or office fires caused by jet fuel were responsible for bringing the buildings down, is going to be shown for what it is. It's an absurdity. It's an impossibility. And Richard can talk to you about that science. So this is really a eventful time, and it's a time for all Americans to basically look up and look back and see where we've come from and how far we've strayed from our course to be the guiding light, the beacon of freedom in the world. And let's, in the sense of many before us, say, let's take America back. And this grand jury presentation to the grand jurors will be the beginning of that happening.
I'm so proud of you guys, and I'm so proud to stand with you. They always tell us, never forget. Never forget 9/11, as they want to rally the American people into more unconstitutional wars. They want us to never forget the murders of nearly 3,000 people. Never forget, so that they can use that event to take us into unconstitutional wars without end. But they never want us to look at the details. Richard, I know your story so well. You pulled over on the side of the road in your car back in like 05 or 06 when you were listening to the great David Ray Griffin. I own all of his books. What was it that he said that woke you up? Was it the discussion of World Trade Center 7 that you hadn't ever been told by the mainstream media?
Yeah, correct, Sean. We have not heard about World Trade Center 7 at all. And, you know, by around 2006, I think it was May 29th, I actually hadn't heard any alternative theories as to how the Twin Towers came down either. So this was all brand spanking new to me. Here I was, a flag-waving Reagan Republican, ready to support our troops and go to war and in Afghanistan and go and get Saddam Hussein for the weapons of mass destruction. You know, I was all on board. And yet this just turned me around in my tracks, because here we have David Ray Griffin talking about the explosive testimony of 118 first responders on record, orally recorded by the Thomas von Eschen, the fire commissioner, and yet the city would not release these oral recordings until August of 2005 by the New York Court State of Appeals. So the New York Times published the transcripts, and Graham McQueen went through it and created an incredible history of finding all this evidence for explosives. And David Ray Griffin was including it on this interview. And I'm going, what are you talking about? All of these first responders, they say like a belt, all these explosions. And then others are talking about before the tower collapsed, we felt a train running under our feet. And again, they're all talking about before there was any collapse of the towers, there were these incredible explosions. And many of them, some of them were talking about before the plane even hit the tower. The explosions were going off in the basement. There's several witnesses about that. So this is extraordinary evidence that I'm just going, what are you talking about? Everybody know it was 19 fundamentalist hijackers who ran these planes into these buildings, and that's how they came down, right? Well, what about the third tower? Here's a 47-story skyscraper, as you mentioned, at 5:20 in the afternoon. Witnesses hear explosions yet again, and then the building comes straight down uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. And yes, that was at free fall speed. That's as fast as a bowling ball falling off the top of the building. Sean, there's 80 columns in this building, and all of them had to have been given up at once, removed basically. That can only be done by explosives in order to facilitate the exact kind of acceleration and symmetry that a typical controlled demolition like the old hotels in Las Vegas do.
But Richard, NIST wouldn't look at explosives. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about the fact that the organization tasked with explaining how these buildings came down in the manner they came down, at the speed they came down, refused to look at explosives, and then dragged their feet for what, 6, 7, 8 years, 9 years before they finally came out with some lunatic explanation that I think involved progressive collapse. Nobody had ever seen it before. Nobody's ever seen it since. NIST couldn't explain the collapse of World Trade Center 7. And I want to just do one thing. I want to play this powerful video testimony from Denny Jowenko. God rest his soul. He was an explosive demolition expert, the owner of his own business. And when he was shown the collapse of World Trade Center 7 on 9/11, he was absolutely dumbfounded and couldn't believe that that building came down on 9/11.
Zie je vanaf boven gaan? Nee, je gaat vanaf onder.
Die gaat vanaf onder, ja.
Toch?
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Er is nagesprongen.
Dit valt anders dan het World Trade Center.
Vind je niet dan?
Ja, je ziet het, de onderste verdiepingen gaan eerst.
Ja, en de rest zakt er gewoon in. Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten?
Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Maar dit is ook op 11 september gebeurd.
Dezelfde dag?
Dezelfde dag.
Dezelfde dag? Weet je dat zeker?
Ja.
Was het zeker weten de 11e? Dat kan geen waar zijn.
7 uur nadat de World Trade Center naar beneden viel.
Ja? Hebben ze hard gewerkt. Het is vakwerk, zonder meer. Ze weten heel goed wat ze doen, die jongens.
He knew right away by looking at it that it was an explosive demolition of that building. And NIST refused to look at it. I think his reaction was the same reaction you had, Richard, and all of your other architect friends. Once they see that collapse, it's a jaw dropper.
And yet most of them don't even know that there was a third tower that collapsed on 9/11. Most architects and engineers, that's why we're all over the world going to conferences, educating people about the collapse of this third tower. This should be the most studied building collapse in history. It wasn't hit by an airplane, you know. So this is what the grand jury is going to see when they get impaneled by the U.S. attorney. This is the most exciting thing that's ever happened because these are independent citizens, as Barbara will explain how that works. It's an incredible opportunity for the 9/11 truth movement, finally, historically.
It's a sea change. It really is. And let's ask Barbara about the power of this impaneled grand jury. 23 American citizens, if they have brain cells to rub together, if they're critical thinkers, if they're intellectually honest people, their mouths will drop too, Barbara. And then what kind of power do they have? Can they call witnesses? Can they call Larry Silverstein? Can they force him in to testify?
Yes, well, most Americans are not aware because the Department of Justice doesn't want them to be aware. But believe it or not, there is a U.S. Supreme Court decision that was actually written by then Justice Scalia. He's now deceased. He was the most conservative justice on the court, a constitutional literalist. And this decision by the U.S. Supreme Court actually states that federal grand juries, which is what we are talking about here, that will be seeing the evidence of what really happened at Ground Zero on 9/11 in the very near future, that federal grand juries are, believe it or not, by the Supreme Court itself, the, quote, fourth people's branch of the federal government, co-equal to the presidency, the courts, and the Congress. So we are talking about phenomenal power, because the Constitution of the United States, I highly recommend that people read it if you haven't for the last year or so. The Constitution of the United States makes this explicit in its text, and that's the reason that Justice Scalia wrote this incredible decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. So the answer to your question is, grand jurors, if they understand this, most of them don't, but if grand jurors understood their true power, that they are impaneled as the fourth people's branch of the federal government, independent of the courts, independent of the U.S. attorney or the prosecutor who brings them information and presents our petition and exhibits to them. They have the power to basically do whatever they want, including taking under oath testimony, subpoenaing witnesses, subpoenaing documents, and believe it or not, even instructing the court to put someone who does not cooperate in a kind of a prison cell until they do. Yes, there's phenomenal power.
I've just got goosebumps here. We've been waiting for this for more than a decade, closing in on 2 decades, and we're going to go back to Richard here in a second. I want to ask Richard about your dogged tenacity. It's so impressive, and the American people owe you so much thanks for it. But David, let me ask you. So your organization, Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, is a separate organization from AE 9/11 Truth. So I want to make that distinction. You can tell us about that. But David, how shocked were you to learn that U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman is willing to impanel a special 9/11 grand jury? I don't personally think we would have seen this happen if the Wicked Witch was in the White House. This is my personal opinion. I don't think if Hillary Clinton was in the White House, this would be happening. Your take on why this is happening now?
Well, that's a whole different thing as far as why it's happening now. Certainly in part, and the main reason it's happening now is because a petition was put before them, and all that evidence is presented in that petition. Now, that was filed, given to the U.S. Attorney on April 10th of this year, and then it was supplemented or amended to add some additional crimes having to do with bombings, and that was on July 30th of this year. We received notice from the U.S. Attorney, at least by letter. The letter was postmarked or dated November 7th of this year. So when we received it, certainly we were surprised, delightfully surprised, or guardedly surprised at the same time, because as you said, this is, or as we were mentioned previously, it's been 17 years till for this to evolve. Now, as to why it's happening now, certainly everything happens not in a vacuum. There's a historical context here, and the U.S. Attorney is appointed by the President of the United States. At least that's as far as my understanding. So I'm not sure what's behind the scene. And as you know, and there's a lot of turmoil in the country right now. So everything's being stirred up, and maybe this is an advantage for us to move forward. This may be the reason that this is happening now, that this is unfolding. And so we're very hopeful, and we're prepared to assist the grand jury. When we wrote to, after we had the acknowledgement from Jeffrey Berman from the U.S. Attorney, we wrote to him, and we told him that we would be willing, and we wanted to assist in whatever way we could, and we intend to do that. They haven't responded yet to see if they'll take us up on that, but to present evidence or help them present evidence, review evidence, and certainly involve architects and engineers because they have gathered so much evidence. I was just talking about before, we mentioned, Richard mentioned the Building 7 and the smoking gun there and how that hasn't been addressed. But just to think that hardly anyone knows about the third high rise, and that high rise is have never, a steel high-rise collapsed because of fires ever. And on that day, there was 3 times it happened, and the explanations, at least for the first 2, was the jet fuel causing the temperatures, but architects and engineers and their scientists have shown us that you need another 1,000 degrees of temperature. But no airplane hit the building 7, but it just came down. And there was explosions in the buildings, and people heard explosions. So that's very significant. That building was not a little building, it was 47 stories, it'd be 610 feet. In 33 states, that would be the biggest building. So I'm not sure where you're from, but it might be the biggest. If it was building 7 was in your state, it would be maybe perhaps the biggest building in that state, and yet hardly anyone in the country even knows it. So going back to the original question, we're very hopeful and optimistic that we've picked we're taking the advantage of some time in history where the door is opening. And as I mentioned previous show, that we're now inside the castle. We've reached the castle. We're inside it. All right. What happens inside, who knows? But we're here, and we intend to proceed inward and upward, and hopefully unfold this terrible crime, as you mentioned, with almost 3,000 people being killed and not proper justice being done.
You know, patriots like us who know the truth, folks, we never forgot. We never forgot that nearly 3,000 Americans were murdered that day, and we wanted to get to the truth for 17 years. And now we're going to get to the truth. And again, I would have to believe that people like Larry Silverstein, I would think, would be getting a little nervous right about now. Richard, you know, I mentioned NIST's inability to explain the collapse of World Trade Center 7. They couldn't explain the collapse of World Trade Center buildings 1 or 2 either, could they? Because I think their computer modeling ends as collapse initiation begins. And again, it's because of patriots like you and your dogged tenacity that I know that. Your work all of these years has kept this story alive, and God bless you for it, Richard.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, NIST was tasked by Congress. Now, this is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a federal agency under the Department of Commerce, which is basically an executive branch appointed by the leadership, appointed by President Bush. And they actually were tasked by Congress to determine how and why World Trade Center 1, 2, and Building 7 collapsed. But hidden in a footnote on page 82 of their footnote 13, they actually put their real agenda. And that is, as you said, to analyze the building failure up to the point of initiation of collapse, but not actually analyze the building failure itself. This is complete fraudulence of the American people. They had $20 million in 3 years. This is not rocket science. They could have done what structural engineers do for a living, calculate the ability of one part of a building to withstand the weight of the building up above it. This is actually, you can produce calcs. Well, what NIST says is their column failure theory. It says that there was fires on about the floor of the jet plane impacts, as we know. And then they said these sagged the floor trusses and pulled in the perimeter columns, and then the whole thing comes down, the top part above the point of the jet plane impacts in the case of the North Tower, drove the whole rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. But there's no video, no photo that shows any part of a building driving the rest of the building down of the upper section. What happens is after, like the firefighters described, all these explosions.
You want to call your mother or something?
And then this building telescopes in on itself. And then there's nothing left after 4 seconds to drive the rest of the building down. What do we see? Well, the grand jury is going to see freely flying lateral structural steel sections weighing 4 tons ejected at 80 miles an hour in every direction laterally. Gravity works down, not out. And these are trailing thick white smoke clouds, which turns out to be aluminum oxide ash from thermite, because there's no other fire that can cause the burning of the ends of the steel beams, as thousands of them are trailing these thick white smoke clouds. So this is the evidence of thermite incendiaries, which is also evidenced by what the grand jury is going to see pouring out of the South Tower 10 minutes prior to its collapse. Molten iron pouring out of the South Tower, molten iron pools of it everywhere in the debris pile, seen by the structural engineers and documented by the firefighters and the iron workers. Tons and tons of molten iron, molten concrete. It takes 3,000 degrees to melt concrete, 2,800 degrees to melt the steel. Well, jet fuel only burns about 600 degrees in open air temperatures, according to its manufacturer. So we have no consistency based on the actual forensic evidence to support the official story. In fact, as the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, finds billions of what? Previously molten iron microspheres in all their World Trade Center dust samples. They're ubiquitous, they're everywhere, and yet they can't explain where they came from, and they don't. R.J. Lee, an independent environmental environmental consulting firm, they also find and document these, and they say, well, they were formed during the event, but we don't know how. You know, it's not before, like iron filings found in house dust. It's not afterward by the iron workers cutting through the steel. Well, what does this mean? Molten iron is the byproduct of thermite. Thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. And so what do we find also in this pulverized concrete, a layer of 4 inches thick, river to river across lower Manhattan, 3 square miles of pulverized concrete down to a fine ash. This is the floors that we should have seen stacked up at the bottom. But the grand jury is going to say, what happened to that 90,000 tons of concrete? And we're going to show them the videos because it's pulverized in midair. There's no stack of even 50 or 10 or 1 floor at the bottom of these towers. So what's found in that pool, in that layer of concrete? Well, an international team of scientists led by Niels Harrit and Stephen Jones find red-gray chips of nanothermite. They thought it was paint but it comes up to a magnet. So it's dual layered, red on one side, gray on the other. And they do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy and find the ingredients of thermite in these unignited chips. Well, they get real curious and zoom in 50,000 times with an electron microscope. And what do they find? The particles of iron oxide and aluminum powder, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. These are the ingredients of thermite in their unignited state. So so they put it into a heater, and it's a differential scanning calorimeter, and at about 420 degrees Celsius, 750 Fahrenheit, they ignite, producing a lot of energy. And what else? Molten iron microspheres. So these chips that amount to 10 tons in the World Trade Center dust all produce the molten iron microspheres that also amount to about 10 tons in all the World Trade Center dust, as documented by the USGS. So we have an internally consistent, repeatable set of experimental data that could be brought to the grand jury, and they could find out exactly how these towers came down, why these 4-ton structural steel sections are trailing thick white smoke clouds of aluminum oxide, the other byproduct of thermite. This is deadly evidence to those perpetrators who the Lawyers Committee are going to be going after as well in these amendments to the grand jury.
Yeah, this is the forensic evidence of explosives, and it's exactly why NIST refused to do computer modeling beyond the initiation of collapse, because the same reason they couldn't come up with a report about World Trade Center 7 if they avoided explosives is the same reason they had to avoid explosives with 1 and 2, because once collapse began, The progressive collapse of those buildings cannot be explained without explosives. And you guys, your team, Dr. Stephen Jones, etc., Niels Harrit, you found the forensic evidence of explosives, which an American grand jury of hopefully patriots will be hearing very soon. Richard and team, I certainly hope that you guys will share with the grand jury somehow. David, if you and your team can help inform them, please share Kevin Ryan's brilliant article, The Top 10 Connections Between NIST and Nanothermites. That might help explain why NIST was so unwilling to actually look at the evidence. Barbara, for those who don't know, and I mentioned it earlier, World Trade Center 7, the collapse of that building, was accidentally reported on by BBC reporter Jane Stanley, reporting live from New York City on the evening of 9/11. And as she described, the Solomon Smith Brothers building has collapsed. That was World Trade Center 7, and yet it was standing right behind her. The satellite feed conveniently fails. That interview ends, and less than 20 minutes later, the building she just reported had already did collapse. What is the statistical likelihood of that happening?
Oh, zero.
Less than zero, it would seem to me.
Yeah, I would say negative 100.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. It seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity.
Yeah, impossible. And also, if I'm not incorrect, my colleagues could correct me if I am, but I believe that CNN also pre-reported. Another major mainstream media television channel network also reported something similar to that ahead of time. The comment that I wanted to make in a follow-up to what Dave and Richard have said about the forensic evidence, it's important, I think. And that is, in addition to the fact that, as they've mentioned, that no steel-framed high-rise structure in the world, let alone the United States, has ever come down due to office fires or even the addition of jet fuel fires, which is the official story of what happened at the World Trade Center 1 and 2 on 9/11 at the Twin Towers. But people also need to know, very important, that those buildings were designed to begin with by the architects and the engineers to withstand the impact, and even more than one impact, but at least one impact per building, of a large commercial airliner of almost the same size and force of impact of what happened on 9/11. The buildings were pre-designed not to fail because of what happened on 9/11. And we have that directly. Richard can state the exact main engineer of the World Trade Center towers themselves, who has gone on record. You can see it on YouTube yourself.
We had designed the project for the impact of our largest airplane of its time, the Boeing 707. That is to take this jet airplane, run it into the building, destroy a lot of structure, and still have it stand up.
Well, Richard or David, either of you could address this. You know, when we see World Trade Center 7 collapse in the fashion that it did, it defies explanation. Of course, NIST knows that, so they just avoided the subject for as long as they could. But when we see other fires around the globe, more recent fires, like, for instance, the Grenfell Tower fire, I've never seen a towering inferno like that one. And here's a picture of that building still intact the next day. A smoldering pile, but still fully intact. It never collapsed at free fall speed.
No, fireproof steel frame high-rises have never collapsed prior to 9/11. And yet we have 3 that collapsed, as you suggest, in the case of Building 7 at free fall acceleration. And then in the case of the Twin Towers, at 2/3 of free fall acceleration. Both of those towers are completely destroyed and dismembered, by the way. And that is at 2/3 of free fall acceleration. It's getting faster and faster and faster, straight down through what should have been the path of greatest resistance, the cold, hard, intact steel below. But all of that was completely shattered, the structure, in under 12 seconds. So that's when the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association Guide 921, suggests look for explosives when you have the high order damage characterized by the shattering of all the elements of the structure. And nearly all the elements of the structure were indeed shattered. But right, that didn't happen at Grenfell. Here's a 24-story building in which a year and a half ago was completely engulfed in flames. And yet we don't have any collapse of that building either. And that's the case in many high-rises. China's a notable example as well, where the CCTV high-rise is completely engulfed in flames, and yet in 2009, and it did not collapse either. So this is going to awaken the minds of the jurors as well.
Back to David Meiswinkle, the president of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Let me ask you this, David. Larry Silverstein is on video, I believe it was in a PBS interview, in which he describes World Trade Center 7 and what happened that day. And he says there was such a terrible loss of life. So I talked to the fire chief, and we decided to pull it.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Pull it is a demolition term. And when he said pull it, I know he now says that he was talking about pulling firefighters out of that building because it couldn't be saved. However, I think if one were to use common sense, one would have to ask, how did the building come down the way it did if it wasn't wired with controlled demolition with explosives? I guess my question for you, sir, as a lawyer is, should Mr. Silverstein be lawyering up at this point?
Well, certainly when the grand jury looks into this matter, I would think that that statement would come to their attention. And as we know that it takes weeks, if not months, to rig a building for explosives. So if he's saying that I told him to pull it, and then to changing his mind and saying I really meant to pull the fire lines away from it, it would seem that this is certainly an impossibility. In other words, they could never have pulled the building. The firemen could have not pulled the building. No one could pull the building. The only way that building could come down on that day is if it was exploded down. That's the only reasonable or normal hypothesis, not office fires.
And that's precisely why Danny Jowenko was so dumbfounded when he was shown that building collapsing, the video of World Trade Center 7. He was dumbfounded because as an explosive detonation expert, he said there's no way this could have happened on 9/11. The same day, he said? Same day? Yeah, same day. He couldn't believe it because he said, well, then they had to work fast.
Hebben ze hard gewerkt?
Right. Well, listen.
Meaning work fast to wire the building. But you and I, we know it had to be pre-wired.
Well, if office fires too, here's the key thing, and Richard was talking about it, is that the key thing, one of the key aspects is in the metal, the temperature for it to melt. And these were simple office fires. These weren't caused by any kind of gasoline from an airplane. And what you're seeing, what we're all seeing that day is impossible. And that's why Danny Jowenko was so stunned by it. It's an impossibility. In a lesser type of analogy, with regards to metal, we all use a grill to cook our hot dogs. And we do it knowing that the metal is never going to melt. The hot dog will be cooked, but the metal will still stay there. All right. Well, in a sense, in a similar way, the metal, unless you get to around 2,800 degrees, which these fires didn't get close to, It would be then they would have some kind of explanation. But to bring it up to 2,800 and higher, you need explosives. Now, before you talked about Jane Stanley, and in our exhibits, in the grand jury petition exhibits, Exhibit 27 is actually that incident you're talking about, where Building 7 is still standing while she's making a press release that it's down, and it still was standing for another 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. So that's listed under anomalies because there was very strange things that happened that don't normally happen, and that was one of them.
I just want people to know where they can read the petition that these 23 patriotic Americans are about to see on the special criminal grand jury there by Ground Zero in the federal courthouse. And you go to www.lcfor911.org. So that's lc4911.org. And it's obvious where you click to read the petition. It's about a little over 50 pages that the grand jurors will be reading themselves. And also there is a link for the exhibits, the evidentiary exhibits. I believe there are 57 of those that you will be able to see. And these include sworn statements. These include peer-reviewed scientific analysis papers. These include video interviews and statements by the eyewitnesses themselves, including 2 eyewitnesses in the basement, the deep basement of World Trade Center 1, the first of the Twin Towers, before the plane hit, to massive explosions before the plane impact. And the same thing happened in World Trade Center 2. So, and I'd also like to say that I just want everybody to be clear that when Richard and Dave say that there's never been a collapse of a steel-framed fireproof structure high-rise before 9/11 or after. They're tongue-in-cheek about that. They also are saying that it did not happen on 9/11, of course.
Thank you for that clarification, Barb.
Yes.
And by the way, Sean, we need to mention here that there is the work that went into this petition is just a fraction of the work that has to be done by the attorneys as a result of their consent to empaneling a grand jury. There's hundreds of hours of work that they have to now do, and that we have to do as well on the architects and engineering side in credentialing and getting the declarations of the testimonies of these expert witnesses. This is a whole heck of a lot of work. And so we're raising funds right now at lc4911.org and at ae911truth.org so that we can actually ensure that we have this expanded body of testimony going straight to the grand jurors in the form of amendments to the petition. So we have assurance, therefore, that the jurors will see all this forthcoming testimony, including, as Dave or Barbara can explain, the persons of material interest.
That's fantastic. Look, we will put the links to support you guys below this video. Friends, as many of you know, my subscribers are among the most kind and generous YouTube subscribers on all of YouTube. Literally, I hear from author after author every time they come on. I've never sold more books than when I've been on your show. These people have the heartbeat for liberty. So guys, I know more than 100,000 of you, 200,000 of you, maybe more will have watched this video. If everybody pitched in $1, come on, let's all get together and let's pitch in $100,000 to help these patriots get to the truth of what happened on 9/11, because it is literally the biggest story of our lifetimes.
I do want to mention, Sean, it's important that also historically, architects and engineers, for the first time in their history, to my knowledge, Richard can correct me if I'm not correct, but for the first time ever, architects and engineers has partnered with another organization, and that is the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, on which both Dave and I are on the board, along with Ed Asner, by the way, amongst other great patriots. And the importance is that our joint fundraising drive does come to an end at the end of December. So please, donate generously and try to do so by the end of the year.
Yeah, and trust me, guys, I have very generous people. You're going to get donations, $25, $50, $100 from some of these wonderful folks. But if everybody listening just took the time to pitch in $1, we could easily raise way more than $100,000. And these people need it, guys. These are the Patriots that are pushing the ball down the field. They're in the red zone, okay? Let's score a touchdown and let's put traitorous people like Silverstein in prison for their crimes. Okay. Let me ask you guys this as we wrap up. And David, I think you have something to say, so go for it. But how do we follow this story? Because you know, and I know, the Mockingbird mainstream media will do their best to ignore it or malign it if they talk about it at all. How do we follow this day by day?
Right. Well, I think it's hard to follow it day by day. We are in the process of trying to have communications with them and assist them. And thus far, they haven't responded recently to our request. As we go forward, there's a lot to do, as Richard said, to prepare for hopefully the opportunity to make the presentation. The grand jury can last up to 18 months and then it could be extended. And it's in secret. So it's not like any kind of New York Times reporter is going to be inside the grand jury. This is a secret proceeding. And we don't even know when it started. We know we were told in November, which is recent, that they were going to, they're complying with the statute. That's 18 U.S.C. 3332, which gives the authority, not the authority, but the responsibility, the duty for the U.S. attorney to do exactly what we're requesting him to do. So in the process, though, and you think about an 18-month period, we are preparing. So we have to do what we call Freedom of Information Acts. We want to do. These are FOIAs, a short and abbreviated form, and that is to do more research and to petition the government in different areas to add to these petition. We can give them more evidence and we can communicate with them. As I said, we have a channel there. We've communicated with them a number of times thus far. We want to prepare the witnesses as they hopefully be called. And with regard to experts, there's within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, did those buildings come down through controlled demolition? And you can build up a testimony of a witness based on his background and based on his knowledge of the science we're talking about, his experiences, and go through basically a presentation where he ends up saying that to grand jury within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty. Controlled demolitions were involved here, or explosions and bombs were involved here, or within a degree of reasonable degree of scientific certainty, it's an impossibility that office fires brought the buildings down. So to that extent, we're going to be preparing and dealing with different experts that can bring that type of testimony, hard testimony, truthful testimony, scientific testimony to the grand jurors. At the same time, we'll be reviewing with the lay witnesses that heard explosions and experienced explosions in the building, and scientists that documented, for example, the seismic activity. In addition to that, we'll be interfacing, hopefully, with them. We hope to be able to go and meet with them to advise them, if necessary, to update them on things that we are more familiar with, because we've been looking at this for many years. And as architects and engineers, been around for over 10 years, 11, 12 years. And so some of these people, especially the lay people, haven't been exposed to it, and the U.S. attorneys haven't either. I'm sure they haven't, and they're being educated now. So we can assume that the grand jury is in process. If they receive first April, and then in July an amended petition, and shortly we'll be giving them more information having to do with, as you mentioned, people of material information. And these are people that should be talked to guide the grand jury in this maze, to assist them in investigating these terrible crimes.
Sometimes you say, well, it goes without saying, but I think we need to say it. And that is that pre-placed explosives on this massive scale in World Trade Center 1, 2, the Twin Towers, and World Trade Center 7, not hit by a plane at all. That pre-placement of explosives could not have been done by so-called jihadists, so-called terrorists, because those buildings are amongst the most highly secure, controlled access buildings on the planet, especially World Trade Center 7, which was effectively, even though they were lessees, they were renting space in the building, it was essentially a federal government building. The World Trade Center 7 housed the largest CIA office outside of Langley, Virginia. It housed FBI, DOD, SEC, and it also housed the Mayor Giuliani's Emergency Operations Center on the 23rd floor. This was one of the most highly secure controlled access buildings on the planet. And to pre-place those explosives in all three of those towers, it would have required the people who were controlling the access, Larry Silverstein, Kroll Associates, etc., access to those towers, and no terrorists, hijackers would have been able to do that.
Just to enter, just a caveat, we're not saying who did that.
No.
We want all the cards being on the table. In addition to the crimes dealing with bombings, and explosions, there's also attached to those crimes conspiracy to commit them and aiding and abetting. So that basically expands the network possibly of people involved. So we would not say this one group or these individuals are definitely not involved or not to be looked at as suspects. We're not saying we know that. We may have our personal opinions as to what happened and who certainly we would look at, but we want to present as an objective presentation as possible and let all the cards be put on the table and let the grand jury then make that decision as to the official story. And if the official story doesn't seem to work, then what is the most likely hypothesis? And what we're saying here, the most likely hypothesis is that controlled demolitions, explosions, and bombs were involved in bringing the buildings down, and we're going to give them some kind of roadmap to hopefully locate those individuals responsible, but we're not saying who those responsible individuals are. And they have the power to do, and we don't, to issue subpoenas, to make deals. They can get documents, they can bring people in, and they have the opportunity, and as I said, the power to really open this up. We have the opportunity, and we have it now, to present what we have, but they can take it much farther, and I'm sure they will. If they're doing a serious investigation, they'll do a much more thorough job going forward.
Well said, both of you. I'll give you guys my final word on this, and then we'll turn it back over to Richard for his final word as we wrap this interview up. One thing I want to say, Barbara, your point is well taken. It wasn't dancing jihadists who were arrested on 9/11. It was dancing Israeli Mossad agents who were then sent back to Israel and appeared on a show in which they said our purpose was to document the event.
We are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event.
These three folks may not share my view on this, but one of the points I've always made as it relates to those Israeli Mossad agents is, how in the world do you document an event without knowing it was going to occur first? How do you get to the right place, time? How do you document an event without prior knowledge? That's my thought on that. So the other thing I would say, team, is that we are all praying for justice. I'm not sure how this will shake out, but it was our esteemed president, John F. Kennedy, who said the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And he went on to talk about how we as a people are inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. God willing, let the truth come out. And again, I want to thank all of you for your patriotism, for your activism, and for your hearts beating for liberty. And we'll wrap it up with Richard Gage. Final word from you, Richard.
Thank you, Sean. This is indeed a historic opportunity for the truth-loving American people. Those of us who are aware, which unfortunately is a minority of Americans, have the opportunity to support these patriotic attorneys in getting all the work that they have to do done. So I just want to encourage everyone to go to lc4911.org and ae911truth.org/grand jury to learn more about this opportunity and what you can do to help. It's an extraordinary. We've been waiting a dozen years for this, Sean. Barbara and Mick and Dave and I and all of our team on each respective sides are unbelievably excited about this opportunity. And we don't want to see it go south. We don't want to see the U.S. Attorney steer this the wrong direction and take over the grand jury. So we've got to do the work, the motions, the amendments to the petition that are required here to keep it on course. So God support us, you know, and yes, God do support us.
Yeah, well,
God is with us.
Yeah, God is on our side here, friends, and thank you all so much for listening, and thanks to all of you who are willing to click the link below and support this team of truth tellers, because, you know, so many naysayers will say one person can't change the world. There's nothing I can do. You know what? Every single one of us can make a difference, and there's no better example than these three people, Richard Gage, Barbara Honegger, and David Meiswinkle. Thank you so much for your time and your activism. And guys, thank you for all you do. Support this effort to get truth out, because together, we're very, very strong. We're very, very powerful. Together, we can bring traitors to justice. Guys,
thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
All right, friends, thanks so much for tuning in. And for real news 24/7, visit us at sgtreport.com. God bless.
God bless.
God bless.
Bye-bye.
You're going to see arrests, and then you're going to see indictments, and then you're going to see convictions. They are scared to death.